Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Regenerative Agriculture Sector Spotlight sponsored by Perennial. This event is hosted by the Work on Climate community. My name is Utkarsh Vaidya, and I lead the events team for Work on Climate. I'll be facilitating this event today with my co-host, Wylie-Modro. Will co-leads the Regenerative Agriculture subcommunity for Work on Climate. Now, for any attendees who are not familiar with Work on Climate, we are a nonprofit focused on making climate work mainstream. We are home to the world's largest climate community where we support people with events such as this and mentorship programs. You can come join us at workonclimate.org. Now, one of our main objectives is to create educational content to help demystify climate work and make it more accessible for job seekers and founders. With that being said, it is our pleasure to host Laura Klein, David Schurman, and Dr. Jim Kellner from Perennial today. Will, would you like to introduce our guest, please?
Yes, I will. All right. Our first guest is David Schurman, who is a computational scientist, an information designer, and an entrepreneur specializing in earth and planetary science applications. He is the co-founder and CTO of Perennial. And prior to Perennial, he was a software lead at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. David also holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from Brown University. Our second speaker today is Dr. James R. Kellner, who is a professor of biology, an environmental scientist, and an expert in land remote sensing. He teaches at Brown University and is a co-investigator on the NASA Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, a mission designed to quantify above ground carbon density in forests using an instrument that is on the ISS, or the International Space Station. Dr. Kellner serves as the chief scientist for Perennial. And then our third and final speaker is Laura Klein, who started her career in biotech and life sciences consulting before transitioning to ag tech and climate. Her interest in regenerative agriculture's impact on climate change began during her undergraduate program at Stanford University, where she continued her studies to complete a master's degree focused on sustainable systems. She currently leads the carbon market strategy at Perennial. And with that, I think I'll transition to David to get us started.
All right. Hey, everyone. Let me do the Zoom screen share dance real quick. Should work first try. Can you all see?
We can see.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the intro, guys. Super excited to be doing this. I've been a part of Work on Climate for over a year now. I've been following the growth and progress for a long time. And, we're happy to be a part of this, helping to educate everyone on, climate, on regenerative agriculture and nature-based carbon removal in general. And we'll go into what all that means and what we're doing about it at Perennial. So just quick background on Perennial. We've been around for about 3 or 4 years. And what we do is we provide trusted tools, standards, and technologies to help verify climate smart agriculture at a global scale. We'll go into what all of that means. But what you need to know for now is that our vision as a company, which we think we can get to if we all work together and put in a lot of effort to this, is unlock soils as the world's largest carbon sink. I'm going to hand it off to Laura now to talk about the background behind regenerative ag, what all these kind of key terms mean, and really get everyone up to speed with this interesting area.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. So yeah, we'll start off with some key terms just to ground everyone for the rest of the discussion. So first, what is regenerative agriculture? This is a group of farming practices that aim to keep carbon in the ground. And we typically talk about it in conversation with conventional agriculture, which is kind of the status quo for industrial agriculture. And it's really focused on maximizing the amount of production, kind of in despite of any environmental degradation that might occur. It's really a yield-focused methodology. Next, when we talk about carbon removal, we're referring to or any other greenhouse gas in the atmosphere to compensate for human-caused emissions. And this relates to a carbon offset, which is a fungible, tradable representation of a 1 ton equivalent of carbon dioxide. And this is either in reference to carbon that's removed from the atmosphere or emissions that are avoided in the first place. Great, so you can go next, thanks. So how do we really utilize soil as a solution for the climate? So to kind of dig into the science of what's going on here, when we think about agriculture, We can consider the fact that a new batch of crops grows every year on a field. And between annual planting and harvesting, the plants are going to develop to maturity, and they drop. But that work that the plants are doing is not just focused on growing the agricultural product or growing the type of the plant that we can see above ground. It's actually also growing a really deep and intense root system. And it's building out kind of the bulk of the plant underground. And as this root system grows, there's microorganisms that thrive in the tiny ecosystem around roots. And this happens really deep in soil. They use the additional carbon and nutrients that are brought by the plant's root systems deep underground to multiply. And as those microorganisms multiply and then die out, they're taking all that carbon that the plant drew down from the atmosphere, and they're storing it through those microorganisms as carbon-rich biomass in the soil. So you can go ahead. So that's really great. The problem is that right now, conventional ag practices, with their prioritization on food production and efficiency over prioritizing soil health in all cases, it really halts this cycle, and it strips carbon, biomass, and other nutrients from the soil. So annually, as this biomass and this soil carbon is trapped, it actually gets brought back up to the surface and re-lost. So there's accumulation of stored carbon. Some examples of conventional practices are tilling, is turning the soil over during planting, and it removes organic waste like those big root systems so that the next batch of crops doesn't have all of those roots and biomass to compete with, but it actually is also removing a lot of that stored carbon. Monoculture, which is planting the same crop type on a field every season, which is causing the soil to have the same plants planted on them and requiring the same nutrients without kind of giving a variety or giving nutrients back to the soil. And then lastly, fertilizer overuse. So this is blanketing fields with synthetic fertilizers rather than necessarily being selective or using other ways to get nutrients back into the soil. Go ahead, David. But what's really exciting about this process is that soil really has the potential to become the world's largest carbon sink. When we think about the carbon offset market, soil can provide up to 25% of the soil carbon or of the offsets available in the markets. Can you, yeah, perfect, thanks. So what are kind of these regenerative agriculture practices that build carbon in the soil? So there's a bunch. I've pulled 5 important ones that we can really utilize in industrial scale agriculture here. One is planting cover crops. Another is integrating livestock into fields. Another is reduced or no-till farming, so preventing those that biomass from getting pulled to the surface. Having a diverse crop rotation on fields, and then improved grazing management. But really regenerative ag, it's not just for the purposes of storing carbon deep in soil. There's actually a lot of co-benefits that we see that come from regenerative agriculture that are just as valuable, and sometimes for some farmers more valuable than the act of sequestering carbon. These are soil erosion reduction, promoting healthier soils due to the increase in nutrients in the soil, water retainment, ecosystem biodiversity, decreased pesticide use. These are a couple of examples, but there's many more. So really the key here is figuring out, as we're making this transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture, it's how do we create markets that allow for this transition to occur? Really, there's a couple different opportunities that we at Perennial see, but they all hinge on developing cheap, efficient, and robust quantification methodologies. So the first is a carbon offset market. If you remember that term from the top, this is basically allowing soil carbon to participate in voluntary carbon markets. These are nature-based solutions that combine removal and abatement benefits in many cases. And it's actually a really new, product in that carbon market. There's a couple of important project developers, but there's a lot of the dynamics of the market are emerging and something that we at Perennial are kind of studying all the time. The next opportunity is supply chain markets. So this is the idea of decarbonizing supply chains through more sustainable direct emissions through sustainable procurement. But the complexity of this market due to non-transparent and also really complex agriculture supply chains leads to a lot of challenges in traceability of commodities. So that's also something that we're focused on overcoming. And there's kind of dual benefits to market participation. For one, it provides farmers with additional revenue streams, which help mitigate the financial or yield risk for switching to regenerative farming practices. But it also, on kind of the flip side, it allows the companies who are funding a lot of these markets to impact the climate in a really positive way by enabling soil to become a carbon sink. Great. So soil carbon is kind of one opportunity within a larger ecosystem of climate solutions. This is something Perennial is thinking a lot about. So within kind of the broad range, especially of the carbon offset space, there's a lot of different solutions and a lot of different projects that are kind of focused on creating offsets and really helping the climate. We can broadly think about these as being divided into two subsets of the carbon offset market. There's nature-based solutions and there's engineered solutions. Nature-based solutions utilize natural resources or systems to reduce emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere, whereas engineered solutions utilize innovative technology to reduce emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere. For nature-based solutions, obviously soil carbon is a nature-based solution, but we also, one of the other extremely prominent nature-based solutions is forestry, which I'm sure that if y'all have been involved in carbon markets or read about them, probably you've read about forestry. It's really one of the most prevalent of all of the carbon credit, of all the carbon credits today. And then an emerging nature-based solution technology is actually ocean biomass sinks. One company in particular is Running Tide, who's utilizing algae blooms to have deep ocean carbon removal techniques. These are really important because they have valuable co-benefits to ecosystems. They're really scalable. So it's a lot easier, a lot more available and quicker to scale projects in soil carbon, forestry, ocean, any of these nature-based solutions, because really already have the underlying technology in photosynthesis. They're also they're relatively inexpensive to develop and implement. So all of these projects are going to require capital to enable, but nature-based solutions tend to be far less expensive than what we see on the engineered side. However, there are some important barriers. So there's concerns with the permanence of the benefit or the durability. Nature-based solutions don't tend to last as long since they're existing in growing, changing natural ecosystems. And there's also some potential of greenwashing criticism around how much benefit these projects actually do from a base case of business as usual. On the other side of things, we have engineered solutions. And as you can imagine, they are kind of a foil to nature-based solutions in many ways. Some examples are direct air capture, which has been in the news a lot lately. This is used especially with a lot of large energy companies to collect and trap carbon at the source, decarbonized cement, and then enhanced weathering projects. The benefits of these is they tend to be highly permanent. So many of these projects claim permanence of 1,000 years or more because they're storing carbon, they're removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it deep underground. These are also primarily removals based, and they have a little bit more methodological certainty because they are engineered or technological solutions and don't have to contend with changes in ecosystems that could potentially impact the methodology. So there's also some important barriers as well. These are extremely, extremely expensive, especially when compared to nature-based solutions. And they're really not rapidly scalable. They require a huge amount of capital to develop and implement even small scale projects. And they also have really limited environmental or community co-benefits. So although these are super important for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they don't have a lot of additional good that's being done to the surrounding earth or communities. Go ahead, David. Great. So obviously at Perennial, we're super passionate about nature-based solutions. Although we work in the soil carbon space, we just see huge benefits to implementing and working on any of the nature-based solutions that I mentioned. So when we think about nature-based solutions, there's a couple key areas of focus in the carbon offset space. So there's project developers who actually run the carbon offset program. Some examples to Google, if you're curious, are Truterra, NCX, and Running Tide. The MRV technology, which quantifies the climate claim that the project developers make. That's where Perennial sits. And another important company that's similar to Perennial but works in the forestry space is Pachama. There's certification bodies that validate the claims that the MRV technology says are happening. So they validate the credit creation. These are Verra, Gold Standard, and the Climate Action Registry. And then finally, the market builders run the marketplace. So they help people who want to purchase carbon credits find the carbon credits to buy. And these are companies like Expansive or Nori. But even though this is kind of the outline of a carbon offset space, that's actually not the only way that you can be working in nature-based solutions. There's plenty of companies that are working on innovative new robotics to help on-farm, that are helpful for on-farm technology. There's opportunities in policy to try and drive climate policy forward, particularly around agriculture or nature-based. If you have experience in finance, there's fantastic opportunities to work in insurance or investing. There's plenty of new VC firms or even larger investment funds that are requiring companies as a basis of funding to have solutions like this in place to help decarbonize. And then finally, there's always opportunities for data scientists, mathematicians, engineers to kind of figure out how we can get a lot of these ideas into the world. So really the bottom line that we want to push is that there's a lot of huge opportunities, but a lot of really significant challenges to working in nature-based and kind of the carbon credit and climate tech space overall. And even though they have the potential to remove billions of tons of carbon, which is the largest potential of any solution, getting there is going to require a lot of problem solving and collaboration and multidisciplinary work. It really is an all hands on deck mentality. And that's why we're super excited to be pulling all of you in today. So we can really all be working on this together.
Thank you, Laura, for that insightful presentation. So before we move on, we have a quick poll for the audience, which we will now launch. If you could all go ahead and select your choices. Great. We are starting to see some results coming in. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, I will end the poll now. So here's what we have for the panel. It looks like for this audience, the biggest themes of interest are carbon sequestration, reducing agricultural emissions, climate resiliency. And then we have a pretty split audience in terms of professional background and also years of experience. So I was wondering, Laura, Jim, and David, can you elaborate a bit more on how regenerative agriculture is very closely related with carbon sequestration and reducing agricultural emissions and climate resiliency?
We'd be happy to do that. I'm happy to take this. I mean, regenerative agriculture is simply a suite of practices that are designed to sequester carbon in soil or keep carbon in the soil that's already there. Carbon sequestration or avoided emissions is the thing that a person believes that they're paying for when they purchase a carbon offset credit. There are other benefits as well. I noticed some of the questions touched on co-benefits like biodiversity monitoring, more efficient water use, reductions in fertilizer. These are things that are associated with the regenerative agricultural practice that are a component of how you get to the point of sequestering carbon. You can't really think about the carbon sequestration component of it or the avoided emissions component independent of the climate piece. The climate piece is the reason why people want to offset their emissions or avoid future emissions. Essentially, you can think about emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere cause damage to the atmosphere. And so the thing that firms or private citizens believe that they're purchasing when they purchase a carbon credit is a reduction in the amount of that damage or the avoidance of a future damage.
Yeah, and just to touch on the other kind of top area of interest, climate resiliency. That's not one we hear necessarily as much, but it's a really important point that gets missed with regen ag. One thing that makes the soil lose carbon and makes the soil degrade faster is warmer temperatures and less in precipitation. So if you have cooler and wetter climates, generally the carbon stability is going to be better, and all of the ecological co-benefits on the farm or the ecosystems around the farm are going to be better as well. The sheer fact of implementing regen ag actually makes soils better able to resist those losses. So if some of you have heard of like the Dust Bowl or other kind of big agricultural crises, this was happening essentially because people would just leave their fields bare for most of the year. And a lot of the chemical degradation would kind of take its toll. That's only going to accelerate under a changing climate. And this is kind of an interesting way to address those as well.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing some insight into that, David. We can move ahead into the next section, which is what Perennial is doing within the space. Take it away, David.
Cool. Yeah, so, a lot of interesting stuff that we covered beforehand, and let me try to break down how Perennial fits in and how we think about the problem. So sort of at a high level, if we're going to scale soil carbon removal up to the point where it's, at billion ton scale, so removing 1 billion tons of CO2 per year or more, we think we need innovation in kind of 3 key areas. One is how it's measured, and I've highlighted that because that's where we started, and that's the problem that we have gone after first. The other 2 are how the economics of soil carbon markets operate. So in order to have this big impact, we're basically going to need thousands or millions of farmers around the world to start switching to these practices. And just like everything in this world, that's not really going to happen unless the right incentives are there. So it is an economics problem. And kind of our future work is related to how can we interface with the buyers of carbon credits and the net zero committers around the world to make that happen from an economic perspective. Finally, it's how these meet in the middle to drive incentives starting at the grower. So without the right incentives, growers won't do this and it won't happen. So that's really the challenge there. I want to hand it off to Jim to talk a bit about what we're working on and how the technology works.
All right, I'd like to try to place the next few slides, which are going to focus on the technology of how this is done. I'd like to try to place this in the context of some of the questions that have popped up. In particular, there was a question about credibility of the carbon markets, and there's a question about barriers to adoption. And I think I want to place this in that context because we see ourselves as attempting to grapple with both of those issues. I want to begin by saying that you can't have credibility around something that you can't measure. And so measurement is really at the core of what we do. When I talk about credibility here, what I mean is that if people purchase a carbon offset, it's very important that they believe and that it actually is genuine. If the thing that is being purchased rests on a flimsy foundation that could change in the future, that leads to the accusations of greenwashing that Laura talked about. That leads to reputational risk for buyers that they really don't want to take. We see that as one barrier to adoption, is protecting them from reputational risk by ensuring the integrity of the asset being purchased. So this is how it's done today. This is actually one of our employees in a field in one of the Dakotas. And what you do is you go out and you dig a hole and you extract what's called a soil core. A core is just a tube of soil down to a standard depth. Usually it's 30 centimeters. You then take that soil core and you send it to an analytical lab. And what they can tell you is how much carbon is in that core as a percentage by mass of the core. This works. The problem with it is that it's extremely expensive from a money point of view. It's also expensive from a time point of view. It takes a lot of person hours. You can see this person doing it to go out and get that number. And even when you get the number, what you have is a number that characterizes one individual soil core. If our technician here had gone 100 yards farther behind himself and collected a different soil core, you'd get a different number. And that's not because of measurement error. That's because soil carbon really is geographically variable. It's not the same thing from one place to another. So the number of times you need to do this on any one individual field, say, to be able to get a good answer for what the average amount of carbon is in that field is pretty high. And that's a major disincentive to participation. The costs are high, and there are some burdens there associated with doing that, both in money and time. So what we're really trying to do here is develop a methodology that eliminates or greatly reduces that physical effort burden to being able to participate. Just knowing what the number is, we need to make it easier for individuals to have that information. And the way we do that is shown on the next slide. We use a combination of remote sensing and environmental data combined with a branch of statistics called machine learning to map this information from space. So the way you can think about this is that we use information from satellites and other environmental data sources like temperature and precipitation and things about the landscape, like whether water would pool in a given area, whether the slope is steep or flat. We use that kind of information as the kind of template on which we're going to calculate how much carbon is in the soil. The way we do that is by going back to the physical soil samples that I just showed you before. So we've gone out and collected thousands of these measurements at lots of places throughout a diverse geography in North America and now also in Australia. And we take a GPS coordinate at the location of every one of those samples. That allows us to pair the physical measurement from the laboratory with what we see from space or the environmental data. And then we can use a statistical model that allows us to predict how much carbon is in the soil when we only have the inputs. It's really a lot like predicting the value of a house on Zillow if all you know is its square footage, number of bathrooms, number of bedrooms. You can use that information to predict the value of the house, even if you don't actually know how much money the house sold for recently or how much it might sell for today. You can make an educated guess, and that's what we've done here. When we do this, we have two different ways we think about it. One is totally hands-off, meaning we just build the model and then we apply the model everywhere and we ask, what is the answer you get? The answer you get has 83% accuracy at the field level across a network of a little bit more than 400 fields across the United States. So without any information on the ground, we don't require anything from a grower, no practice information, no access to the field required, working strictly using remote sensing and other environmental data, we can get to 83% accuracy. Sometimes customers might want better than 83% accuracy. We can talk a little later about what the use cases might be for 83 versus something higher. We can augment the model using local information. So we can actually go out and we can collect a few physical samples. And when we do that, what we find is that we can boost the accuracy up to well above 90%. In this case, one test example we got it up to about 95% accuracy. I want to emphasize here that what we're able to do is get to 95% accuracy using a combination of remote sensing, environmental data, and physical samples, but with way fewer physical samples than it would take if you were trying to get to 95% accuracy using physical samples alone. We've therefore reduced the barrier to entry and reduced the cost and made this possible at scale. On the next slide, I want to speak just a little bit about what this looks like in practice. So on the back end, we're making these quantifications and predictions. We generate a map of soil organic carbon throughout North American agricultural land, for example. And then we can take the information we have, which is at the resolution of an individual pixel from a satellite sensor. And that pixel resolution is 10 meters, which means that every pixel, if you zoomed all the way in on it, like you maybe have done on Google Earth, each square is 10 by 10 meters. But we can then take that and aggregate that up to any arbitrary unit that a customer might want. For example, we could aggregate up to the level of a field, and we could color the fields using the average number of the pixels that are in the field. That's what you can see on this tablet here on the screen in front of you. But we can also go to higher levels. We could say, what about a supply shed? A supply shed refers to the region of agricultural productivity within which the grain being produced is supplied. And so you could imagine, for example, a consumer packaged goods company might want to know, what is the carbon footprint of all the grain that I'm producing? And they don't necessarily need to know exactly which piece of grain came from exactly which farm, but they might want to know, if they purchase grain from a particular county in Iowa, then what's the draw area from which that grain was derived, and what's the carbon profile of that area. We call that a supply shed, and that's one of the use cases where a lower level of accuracy, the level of 83% or so, might be sufficient. If you were going to generate a carbon credit, then you might want to go all the way up to the higher level of 90% plus. When all of this is said and done, what we produce is a map, and this is what it looks like here. This is a map where the colors you're seeing here are, the background image is just a natural satellite image, but then overlaid on top of that is the amount of carbon, colored from blue to a light green or yellow, where blue is low and light green or yellow is high. This map has a 10-meter resolution, so if you could do the zoom in on this thing, we've shown you one zoom in region here in the box, what you start to see is spatial detail. So you can see both the broad geographic view, the gradient that runs, say, from Texas to Minnesota, but when you zoom in, you start to see field to field variation, and that's the variation that is related to local decisions made by individual growers, individual landowners, and also has some environmental components as well. I'm going to hand it over to David now, who's going to spend a few minutes talking to you about other components of the carbon offset, including other greenhouse gases.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So just to kind of close out, what we're working on in the short term. So we've spent a lot of time doing the modeling for the soil carbon storage piece of this, which has traditionally been really difficult and the most time-consuming aspect of this. It's also the only carbon removal focused part of this. However, there are a bunch of other greenhouse gases that come off of farms as a result of agricultural activity. Two of the main ones being nitrous oxide, N2O, and methane, CH4. Nitrous oxide comes off by microbial decomposition of nitrogen in the soil. So you get higher N2O emissions if you apply a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. This even happens if you have cows walking around on the field, and in their excrement, they also contribute to this, and even leaving crop residue. So it's something important to account for. And then methane comes from cows actually, burping and farting, to put it bluntly. And that's actually like a substantial fraction of annual US emissions every year. So accounting for the whole picture of the farm is important in both the analytical case, where we want to provide sustainability metrics on a large scale, but also it's important to account for when you're generating a carbon credit, because you want to make sure that your change in activity hasn't kind of made more of another category increase to outweigh the sequestration that you're getting in the soil. Switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about us as a company. So, we just raised a Series A. In total, we've brought in about $25 million from a very mission-aligned set of investors. These include Temasek and Bloomberg, who are both very much moving into the sustainability space, and also the financial metrics behind this. And also Microsoft, the Climate Innovation Fund there, who invests in, kind of state-of-the-art carbon projects. And Microsoft, as a buyer of carbon credits, is really leading the industry in the science-backed analysis of what to buy and how, as a large company, you should be offsetting your footprint. Most of our investors have actually indicated that they want to buy carbon offsets through us that have come from the farms that we work with. So this is a key component in aligning the incentives behind scaling soil carbon removal, like I said. And that's kind of going to be a big focus of our work going forward. One other thing I want to say here, just because I think it's on everyone's minds, we're entering a time of economic uncertainty. We are very fortunate to have gotten a lot of extra funding and runway right before that. So while we're growing, we're doing so at a reasonable and really kind of intentional pace so that we can build a sustainable business as we're hiring. A little bit about our team. So we are a fully flexible company for remote and hybrid work. We kind of have a center of mass around the Boulder, Colorado area. We'll get to that on the next slide. And we really value just collaboration. Everybody here is mission driven and, kind of working for something greater than yourself. When you're contributing to climate, that's kind of the sense that you get. And for those of you who haven't had that experience yet, even though the climate problems are hard, it's really rewarding to get up every day and do that. So, we get together in person pretty often. We're going to be flying people out who are remote at least a couple times a year. So, everyone can have that face-to-face interaction and like that. In terms of who we're hiring, we're really looking for people across all departments. So engineering, data science, operations, product, commercial. These are the roles that are posted right now for us. We're going to be more than doubling the team size this year. So there are going to be more to come across all departments as well. And you can check that out on the careers page on our website. Yeah, I think that's all. And we'll get to questions.
Thank you, Jim and David, for describing all of the amazing work that you do at Perennial. So we will now move into the structured part of our Q&A. And while we do that, for those of you in the audience, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A section on Zoom and also upvote any questions that you would like to see answered. To start us off, Will, would you like to kick off with the first question?
Yes, thank you. So this is very carbon credit focused, but it seems like the demand for carbon offsets is outstripping the supply right now. However, in the perception, it seems like the price for those carbon credits are still relatively low. They're like $20 per ton, at least compared to some of the engineered solutions. So why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's important to point out, Will, as you just did, that although $20 seems really low compared to engineered solutions, which are in the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per credit, soil carbon is actually really high compared to other nature-based solutions. So high quality forestry projects tend to go for closer to $12 to $15, but they can be as $3 to $5. Represents a high water margin, which is far less developed and mature than something like forestry. So just wanted to set the stage there that $20 is actually pretty high. That being said, though, it is, as a couple people in the Q&A pointed out, still way too low to be incentivizing wide-scale adoption of regenerative agriculture practices. So we need to see that price double, triple, quadruple, even greater in the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully earlier, in order to get this wide-scale adoption of regenerative agriculture. The reason that I think this price is so much lower, kind of like it's just a lot lower, is that it's being anchored to other nature based, like what we see in forestry. But I think really what needs to happen is there really needs to be a within these kind of broad strokes of engineered versus nature-based. And buyers and project developers need to recognize that each of these types of offset programs is really unique, both in terms of how they're developed, as well as the benefits that we see from each of the different offset types. They all come kind of with their own unique flavor, even though we think of all of these as a carbon offset representing 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And they should really be priced according to kind of their own unique features. Soil carbon being very different than something like forestry.
Awesome. Thank you for that context. Utkarsh?
So firstly, thank you, Jim. I noticed that you and Laura as well, you've been going through and answering a lot of these questions. So for those of you who asked, some of the questions have been answered in the Q&A section already. I have another question for you, Jim. What are some of the limitations of remote sensing, and how do you see these changing, or how do you see the technology evolving in the future?
Great question, and I appreciate it. Well, there's certainly some of the obvious limitations are that because you're dealing with an Earth observation platform, there's a bunch of stuff that's in the way, right? There's clouds, there's smoke, there's haze, there's snow, and there's other things that get in the way of seeing what you want to see. And so you've got to find ways to work around those things. And that's a problem with remote sensing. It's becoming alleviated just because of the sheer volume of remote sensing data that's now available. There are constellations of satellites in orbit now that image the entire land surface of the Earth every single day. Now, most of the data they collect is not useful because a lot of it has cloud cover and smoke and haze and snow and all those other things I just mentioned in it. So over time, we're overcoming that limitation just by having a lot of data. You know, if you get data every day and only 1/10 of it is useful, well, that's still one good observation every 10 days, which is pretty good. So that's one limitation. You know, another one I guess I would say is it's a limitation depending on how you look at it. Remote sensing is just data, but what you need to do is draw a conclusion about something, right? In our case, the conclusion we want to draw is about the carbon stock or the change in the carbon stock. And that requires combining that data from remote sensing with other information. In our case, that means machine learning or some other statistical framework to draw that inference. I don't think that's really necessarily unique to remote sensing, but the large volume of information you have from remote sensing means that you need to learn how to deal with data in a different way. You can't point and click your way through this problem. You have to learn how to write code and store big data sets and archive big data sets and access them quickly and things like that. In terms of what's coming in the future, I think we really are in something of a golden age or some kind of inflection point right now in Earth observation. And maybe the best way to describe that is conceptually, just think back to what it was like 20 years ago. You know, when you saw Google Earth for the first time, or when you saw a smartphone for the first time, that's kind of happening now in remote sensing. There are multiple National Space Agency missions that are predicated on measuring things related to carbon changes or carbon stocks. One that's upcoming is called the NISAR mission. It's a collaboration between NASA and the Indian Space Agency. It's a radar sensor designed on measuring carbon density in low carbon forest and scrubland, savanna-like situations. There's a European Space Agency mission called Biomass that's coming. That's another radar instrument. Of course, the one that I work on is the NASA Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation. That's a NASA instrument focused on forests. There are a bunch of others, including some spectral sensors that are going to be more aligned with soil carbon, and all of these things are happening. There's also a bunch of private companies getting involved on the sensor side as well. You may have heard of Planet, the company in San Francisco that has recently gone public that makes CubeSats. These are tiny shoebox-sized satellites that provide red, green, blue, near-infrared images of the Earth at very high spatial resolution down in the 1 to 3 meter range. And there's a bunch of other startups starting to get in on that kind of game too. So if you have an interest in the technology, it's going to be a drinking from a fire hose kind of problem here in the next 10 years, and there's not going to be any shortage of problems for people to solve.
Great, thanks
for that context. So this next question is very much inspired by John Kemp's podcast and also Cohen's Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast. It's a very typical one, but if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about the global food system overnight, what would it be? And anyone can answer that.
I'm happy to start. It's a wonderful question. I think what I would change is probably the thing that I have found most challenging about this problem is the knowledge that there's all this information out there, that the problem we're trying to solve is actually knowable, but the information is locked away in either proprietary formats, it's privately held, or otherwise just not organized in a way that makes it accessible. For example, modern farming equipment collects all kinds of data about what's happening on every square foot of agricultural land, how much fertilizer was applied, what the outcome was, whether it was successful, whether there was a lot of crop grown or a little, pesticide applications, all of that stuff is intensively tracked. And from a computational machine learning data science kind of perspective, you look at that, you think the information's out there to really solve this problem, but it's proprietary. It's held by private citizens. There are certainly some privacy concerns that would need to be overcome because people don't necessarily want to give that information up, or it's just sitting on the servers of a private company someplace who built the software that is operated inside the farming equipment, for example. If we could find a way to organize and make that kind of information publicly available, it would really allow us, I think, to move the needle, not just on this problem, but on problems related to the efficiency of agricultural production more generally. So that would be my answer.
Cool, I can go next, and apologies for my video off. I'm having some Wi-Fi issues. Yeah, I think that where I would take this, I'm really interested in the idea of like supply chain decarbonization. And, I think in an ideal world, we'd have a way to have a much more traceable agricultural supply chain. I am really excited with the opportunities there, but there's so much complexity in the system that it makes it really challenging to implement changes.
Yeah, and I guess, how I would answer this, it's just so many ways you could go with this question. I think about how food is distributed kind of at a macro scale, and I think we can do a lot better. That's probably what I would change. I don't think we are, as a society, prepared at all for what is about to happen later this year, especially in Africa, as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They provide about half the wheat in the world. It's an insane amount of food. Our co-founder as well is Ukrainian, so we kind of have particular connection to this problem. And, if we had kind of a supply chain from the US that got some of the grain that we produce to other parts of the world in a better way. China is a big producer as well, so is Brazil, and just kind of having some redundancy at a macro scale. I think that would be really good.
Thank you. Also, that concludes the structure part of our Q&A, and we can start moving into some of the audience questions. And as I mentioned, again, a lot of them have been answered by Jim, Laura, and David already. So please check out the answer tab as well. Let's just move to a few of the ones that are still open. The first one's from Azealia. For someone who is completely new to Regen Ag, do you have any resources you recommend for someone to pivot their career into this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I can take this one as someone who only a couple years ago pivoted my career into the Regen Ag industry. I would say it's really twofold. The first piece being take a lot of initiative to do a lot of this research on your own. It's a really complicated industry, but being able to come into interviews or conversations or networking with a working background of a lot of this terminology and a lot of the lexicon that we use, like SBTI, Scope 3, carbon offset markets, voluntary carbon markets. That is really helpful because it allows you to speak the language and kind of move on to stuff that's a little bit more interesting than just, going over key terms. And And then the next piece I would say is be really open to what you think you want to do. The climate tech space and the regen ag space are both growing incredibly rapidly, but it still is a pretty niche industry. And so what I found to be helpful was take whatever opportunities you can get, even if it's not the most ideal position for you at that moment. Figure out a way to break in and get your foot in the door. And it becomes a lot more easy to be mobile within the industry once you start to get a little bit of knowledge.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add, with regenerative ag, since people have been farming in one way, especially in this country, for so long, there's a lot of grower education that's happening right now about these things. And so some of the leaders in the space, like Indigo Ag, put out a lot of good educational material on what is regenerative ag, what does it mean to switch, what does it mean for profitability, targeted at growers, so they can help make the switch. And so kind of piggybacking off of that ongoing education effort might make sense.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I can definitely attest for running the channel that you definitely need those points, and doing the research very much helps. One of the questions that also came from David is there any good work being done to integrate biodiversity monitoring with regen agriculture practices?
Yeah, I think this is a really key area that's maybe even newer than the carbon work, and I think it's another one that is really important to work on. The folks at Audubon, the bird conservation organization, are doing some really good work here with their conservation ranching program, and there are others I can point to more outside of ag, but yeah, we need more help there.
Anything to add to that, Jim or Laura?
There's a bunch of questions in the chat that I really would love to answer that are not that question, but I'll leave it to you.
Please go ahead. Yeah, if you want to pick up one of the ones that you think you would like to answer.
Well, I like the questions that are really critical, because those are the exciting things to think about. And there's a bunch of questions in here about the concept of permanence or durability of the offset. And I'd like to address that, because I think this is a point where we can speak to some innovation that needs to happen in the structural accounting issues around the carbon offset that are really bigger than Perennial as a company, but that speak to whether this is really going to fly out there in the real world. So first of all, let's talk about what we mean by durability and permanence. When somebody pays for a carbon offset credit, they want to know that it's going to be there for a long time. And for example, if I want to emit 1 ton of carbon and I pay you, and you store 1 ton of carbon, and then I feel like I've achieved what I sought to do, I've offset my emission, but then next year your 1 ton of carbon goes into the atmosphere, that's really not what I paid for. I paid for a permanent benefit and you did not supply it. And so the burden is on you to guarantee that that sequestration is permanent. That's essentially the way the market is predicated today. I think the thing that I would challenge about that is, in my opinion, the concept of permanence should be shifted. Instead of being binary, it's permanent or not permanent, to choosing a time horizon that you value. So for example, you could say, I seek to offset the impact of emitting 1 ton of carbon, and I seek to offset the damages that 1 ton of carbon will cause in the atmosphere over the next 100 years, or 50 years, or 20 years. And this concept recognizes that carbon that goes into the atmosphere, it doesn't just stay there forever. It comes out naturally on its own, due to the natural activity of the forest carbon sink that exists no matter what we do, or the ocean sink as well. And so not all of that carbon remains in the atmosphere, but you could calculate, using a method of accounting called ton-year accounting, what is the accumulated damage that emitting 1 ton of carbon today would do over the next 100 years. And then that's the total amount of damage that you need to offset. This is something that there's a lot of academic work and a lot of writing on this topic, but it hasn't really caught up with the carbon markets in practice. I think that eventually it will. And when it does, one of the nice things about it is that it removes the need to think about storing 1 ton of carbon forever, and therefore removes the need to think about durability. For example, if you wanted to offset the impact of 1 ton over 100 years, you could similarly store the equivalent impact of 1 ton over 100 years for 1 year, right? So let's just say that that number is 46% of it. Let's say there's 46 ton years over a 100-year time horizon. Then if you could store 46 tons for 1 year, that's the equivalent of storing 1 ton for 100 years, because 46 is what actually remains in the atmosphere. This gets rather academic, as you can tell, but what this work is trying to do, and where I envision the market might go, is toward not avoiding the concept of durability or permanence, but thinking about it in a way that is avoiding the need for people to make a claim that they simply cannot make. Nobody can guarantee that a nature-based carbon sequestration quantity is going to be in the soil or forest forever. It's just not possible to do. So we have to find another way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for providing that context. And one question, I know you did answer it in the Q&A, but I think it's also a very interesting question, is can soil become carbon saturated, and then what's the effects of that?
The answer is yes, it can. This is an active area of research, both in soils and especially in forests. And the idea here is that it's not a sponge that can just take up carbon forever, that eventually it will get filled. Think about it like a swimming pool. If you're dumping carbon into the swimming pool where the carbon represents water here, eventually you reach the limit. So the question is there a limit? There's really no dispute that there is a limit. There is a dispute about how close we are to the limit and what the rate of approach to the limit is. So in practice, if we start to get to the point where we're getting close to the limit, it's likely that the rate of sequestration would slow down. And if carbon is being credited based on how much is coming out of the atmosphere each year, what that would mean is that the amount available to be used as an offset, and therefore credited, would also decline over time as the carbon sink fills up. One thing that would do is it would incentivize thinking about the other side of the carbon offset. If you remember back in the very beginning, Laura talked about 2 ways of thinking about this. You can create an offset by removing something from the atmosphere. So you're taking water out of the swimming pool. You could also have an offset that's based on avoiding putting more water into the swimming pool. That's called avoided emissions. As carbon stocks accumulated, as the swimming pool gets full, as the soil gets full of carbon, what that means is you've accumulated an extremely valuable resource. You now have a whole bunch of stored carbon there, and you really want to prevent that carbon from going back to the atmosphere. So what I suspect that would do would be to incentivize individuals to act in ways that will avoid what would be a potentially large future emission.
Thanks, Jim. We only have 2 minutes, so maybe a really quick answer to a pretty complicated question. Do your models need to be able to see the soil? If yes, in regenerative systems where the soil needs to be covered all the time, how will this work?
They do not need to see the soil. What they need is the ability to exploit a consistent relationship between the data we use in the model, so that's remote sensing data and environmental variables, and the amount of carbon that's in the soil, right? In the same way that Zillow doesn't need to see inside your house to be able to come up with a value for it. They just need to find something that they can get access to, bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage. They need that stuff, and then they can do a reliable job predicting the value. Same thing here.
Thanks for that insight, Jim. And thank you to Laura and David as well for sharing all of these wonderful insights with us. I will bring the event to a close with that, being mindful of time. So this event will be recorded and posted on the Work on Climate YouTube channel if you would like to go there and view some of these answers again. Just a quick note on Work on Climate. We have gotten this far as an all-volunteer organization, but we are fundraising to hire full-time staff. So you can join us at workonclimate.org, donate to us at workonclimate.org/donate, or reach out to our executive director, Eugene, at workonclimate.org. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to those of you on the panel, Jim, Laura, and David. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.